already done because I did so many recordings last semester because of being remote. So there's some that, lack the classroom participation and whatnot as well. And maybe are a little bit clearer adapted. I'll include those as well. We looked at Diego Rivera. Remember Diego Rivera? He was this great Mexican muralist. He was probably the most revered artist in Mexico during his time and during his lifetime. He was kind of like the grandfather of Mexican art. And we started by looking at the work of his wife, Frida Kahlo, who was a great artist in her own right. And the artwork that's in the 250 is number 140. So go ahead and open up your note taker to 140. And this is called the Two Fridas. The Two Fridas. So what I want you to do is just to take a moment to look at the painting, right? It's a rather square painting. Let's go ahead and look at this painting. And what I want you to do is just to look at how the two Fridas are different. So we're once again just kind of looking at visual evidence of how the Fridas are different. And then we'll try to analyze it and figure out why she looks different in these two side-by-side images. Okay, so take a moment just to look at it. Let me turn off the light for you guys so you can see it a little bit clearer. Okay, who would like to volunteer? How is she portrayed differently on the left and on the right?
They're shown like different culturally in both images. Like one is like white and like wearing a dress, while the other is like wearing cultural stuff, sitting on the floor and has darker skin.
Very good. So when you look at it, she's wearing two different costumes. And for there's two, I shouldn't even say costumes, they're clothing, right? She's wearing two sets of clothing. And so when you look at her on the left, right? If you look on the left here, you see that she's wearing a long white dress. Does anyone know where that kind of style of dress would have come from? This was how a lot of the immigrants from Spain dressed. So here she's dressing like a colonized Spanish woman, right? So this is kind of the style that's coming out of Spain. And like Varun mentioned, even her skin complexion looks pretty white there, right? Frida Kahlo, like I mentioned, grew up in Mexico City in a relatively like upper middle class family, maybe even like slightly like lower upper class. And her mother was Mexican, her father was an immigrant from Europe, he was Jewish. And so she was of mixed heritage. And so she, growing up more affluent, was really raised in kind of that colonization upbringing. So she wore a lot of Western style clothing, right? So here she's portraying herself a little bit paler and in that Spanish attire. But then on the right, she's wearing clothing that's probably more native to an Indian, to someone who lives in Mexico, someone who's native to that land. And her and her husband were always painting works talking about the great historical Mexican past. And he liked her to wear her hair in traditional style. She had long hair, she would braid it, and she would weave it in these really elaborate setups that you sort of see alluded here. Sometimes you wrap fabric in it or ribbon and knot it up to her hair. And he liked her to dress in like native clothing. And so on the left, or excuse me, on the right, she portrayed herself as a native Mexican, right? So she's wearing more clothing native to that region. And when you look at the imagery, they're connected. How are they connected? In what ways is she connecting these two parts of Frida? Keep in mind this is a self-portrait or a double self-portrait. portrait?
They're holding hands, I think, with the heart, the two hearts are connected to each other.
Right. So we got her holding her own hand, and then we have these two exposed hearts. Of course, hearts are great symbols of your love, your intention, your emotional content of your being, and we have them connected with a vein or an artery, right? So she's really focusing on how she kind of has a little bit of kind of like, there's like two sides to who she is, right? And many of you come from immigrant families. My husband comes from an immigrant family, and he is always brought up to me that sometimes he doesn't feel American enough, sometimes he doesn't feel Guatemalan enough. And you can sort of see like she's kind of playing on this idea of like, who is she? What is her identity, right? And that's kind of that theme that we have for today, right? It's all about cultural identity. And so she's trying to hold on to both parts of her cultural identity, right? So she's got her hands holding her other hand, the vein or artery part, and they're also sitting together like friends, right? So even though there might be a sense of tension, she's also trying to rectify that this is who she is, right? She is both parts. And if you remember, her artwork is really about her. Most of her paintings are autobiographical. They're stories about her, right? So in her art, when she was before Diego, she did a lot of traditional subject matter. She often dressed herself in kind of colonial clothing. And then after she was in a relationship with Diego, that's when she started to dress in more indigenous Mexican clothing and hairstyles. And if you look on the right side where she's more like identifying with that Mexican culture, she's actually holding a little painted locket. And in that locket, there's a little image of baby Diego. So that's an image of her husband connected there too. And you can see that the artery, right? You can see it continues, so that vein wraps around her arm and actually connects to her husband too. So her heart is connected to him. And they had a very tumultuous affair, like I mentioned before. He had affairs with her sister. He had affairs with many other people as well. He broke her heart constantly, right? She has other pictures to kind of talk about her upbringing. Here's a family tree that she painted for her family. So you can see, this is like the compound in which she lived. And then that's baby Frida there. And then she's talking about her heritage. So you can see that she's got some mixed heritage on her father's side. So actually, I'm not sure if her father was an immigrant, but maybe her grandfather was. Right? So a lot of people consider her work to be very surrealist. Remember that she did not say I am surrealist, because my work is about my life. It's not about fantasy. It's not about subconscious, unconscious. I know what I'm doing. It just happens to be my life is kind of tragic, and this is the best avenue for me to kind of explain my life. But it does have surrealist qualities to it, right? Can anyone pinpoint any parts of this that feel surrealist to you? Keeping in mind that this is probably more like veristic, so that's like super realistic version of surrealism. What's a little odd about this that makes it feel like it's fantasy based or based on her imagination? Alana, can you help me?
Maybe the fact that her hearts are exposed and you can't really see them in real life.
Exactly. So she's got exposed hearts. She's got these veins that obviously wouldn't live without outside your body either, connecting her together. What about the setting? What's strange about the setting? Mary, can you help me with this one? What's strange about the setting, where it takes place?
Well, it looks like clouds in the background / waves. I can't really differentiate between the too. So it could be like her mind that she drew as the background.
Right? The background seems very inventive. When you look at the ground, you're like, is that floor? Is that landscape? Like, is that like dusty, barren landscape? Which is actually something Dali did all the time. We didn't get to really look at Dali very closely, but a lot of his works have kind of these desert sort of vast sort of landscapes with mountains in the distance. And then the wall, right? Or with the sky is like these clouds or these kind of confusing, like stormy white clouds. So we're not quite sure. Is this inside, outside? You know, is it floor, wall? Is it land, sky? It's really ambiguous, right? So, and then of course the idea that this is a double portrait, two people, same people, not conjoined twins, not, you know, in a mirror, right? These are two versions of her together, right? So throughout her life, she had many, many surgeries. I mentioned that as a child, she had polio, then she was in that tragic accident, she was in a trolley accident where a rod pierced her spine. When she was married to Diego, she had several miscarriages. She was in chronic pain. And so she was always in and out of the hospital, in and out of like having to be on bed rest to kind of heal. She had really, she had corsets and back braces to keep her back in the line. So she has a lot of pieces where she's really communicating her personal struggle with chronic pain and her lack of being able to conceive a child. Here's one that she did after her husband cheated on her with her sister, where she kind of has herself with, it's called Diego on my mind. So he's literally on her mind. And then there's a great Frida Kahlo movie, if you like movies. I forgot to check and see where it is free, if it's currently free on anything like Netflix or Hulu or anything like that. But it's a great one with Salma Hayek, and I love it. It's the director is Julie Taymor, who does a lot of art films, and she basically does the movie in the style of surrealism. So the artwork, the movie kind of looks like, sometimes things look like they're her paintings coming to life. Maybe after the test, we might get a chance to watch this movie. I actually have several really cool movies that we can kind of pick for after the test to have some fun. All right, so we have one more artist to look at. Now, he is not of Mexican descent, he's actually Cuban, and his name is Wifredo Lam. When you look at this painting by Wifredo Lam, do you guys have any idea who or what art style he could have been inspired by? Anyone have any educated guesses? Looking at maybe the color or the style in which he paints. Anyone have an educated guess for me? Do you guys recognize this guy who's standing there? This is Wifredo Lam right here. This is Picasso, right? So he was inspired by Cubism, right? So he has this idea of showing profile and frontal views, showing multiple views at the same time. And also it's kind of reminiscent of some of Picasso's early symbolic work, so his Expressionism, where he uses color to show emotion. So it kind of looks like it's done in that blue period, right? So when we look at Wifredo Lam's work, it's kind of a combination of Cubism and surrealism. And this is actually something that we will continue to see today as we move into abstract expressionism and the development of it in, especially in New York, in the New York school. And so a lot of these Cubist works start to feel kind of surrealist in a way. They start to look like they're amorphic. And so this biomorphic style of Merlin Alt, where the imagery looks abstract and kind of surreal, kind of dreamlike, kind of fantasy based. It's more than just a fracturing of space like synthetic cubism, or excuse me, analytical cubism, It's often made to feel fantastical, based on imagination, and sometimes there's more like emotional content to it, that it was just strictly Cubism, which of course we just wrote that essay about, which is more about form and about painting. So this is the piece that we have in the 250. This is number 142, and it's called The Jungle. 142, The Jungle. You can take some notes with your note takers on this. Right? So let's go ahead and look at it and see if we can figure out how is it Cubist and how is it Surrealist. So for context and form, how is this inspired by Cubism? Emily, can you help me out with this one? How does it seem like it's Cubist? Thinking about like maybe Brock or Picasso.
I don't know, I just think that geometric and kind of like, you can't really tell what,
Right. So it's very geometric, right? There's a lot of vertical elements to it, circular elements to it. You were saying it was kind of hard to understand what the heck is actually going on. And part of that is, remember in Cubism how with the foreground, like figure ground or foreground background kind of merges, right? There's really not a lot of visual depth here, right? So there's this kind of like repetition of elements, geometric elements, and this lack of figure ground, lack of foreground background that makes it feel Cubist. Then what's surrealist about it? This one might be a little bit tougher for you, all right? Oh, here, I forgot this one too. There's a limited palette. There's a little bit more color here, but it's really dominated by those blues as well. And the surrealist part of it is that it has a juxtaposition of irrational imagery. So it's putting together imagery that you normally wouldn't see together. Now we'll diagnose that in just a moment so that you can see what I'm seeing here. It's a release of the subconscious mind, and there's a lot of biomorphic form. So it's kind of these imaginary creatures that he made by just kind of putting marks down on the canvas, and these kind of, they're not necessarily arbitrary shapes. He decided to paint the head this way and the legs this way, but they just don't feel very representational, right? They feel like they're based on his imagination. So if you pay close attention, you look at the top of them, you'll see that they have heads. And these heads, right, sort of feel like masks. Can you guys see this? This one kind of looks like an animal mask. There's two eyes. There's kind of like a snout and like hair. Here, there's one that maybe looks a little more human. There's a breast here. There's a head. So there's all these kind of mask-like creatures with these long, long limbs. And he was from Cuba, right? And of course, Cuba, like the United States, has a kind of a dramatic history. And so a lot of people immigrated based on like the triangle trade from Europe, Americas, Caribbean. He had, there's a blending of African culture with slave culture, with Spanish culture, with French culture, with all these other immigrants moving in. And so he painted really reflecting his Cuban culture, which is very blended. And so the masks come from Santeria. Santeria is a religion that's basically a blending of Catholicism coming from Spain with African beliefs. So a lot of people, like equivalent to this is that voodoo, I think, comes from Santeria, if I remember, right? So it's kind of this Afro-Cuban religion, right? And so keep in mind that Africans came from the slave trade to Cuba. And so we have that artistic tradition of masks coming from Africa. And of course, if you notice the picture of him with Picasso, right? He is of African descent as well, right? So he's showing his cultural identity. And then when you look at the long limbs, you look at the legs, you look at some of these vertical elements that reach to the top of the canvas, they recall sugar cane. And sugar cane is not native to the Caribbean, it's not native to Cuba, and all of these different islands in the Atlantic and the Gulf, or not the Gulf, but the Atlantic. And they would have been cultivated, they would have been brought to this area, and then of course, slave labor was used to cultivate it for alcohol in that triangle trade. So he's really recalling the history of this island. And probably, you know, where his ancestors came from. Okay, so we have one artist to look at in looking at early 20th century American art. So that we're talking about the art of the United States, I should say. But I want to show you a few as well. So I'm going to do this as fast as I can because there's going to be people you recognize and maybe later like want to go like look at more in-depthly on your own. So in the early 1900s, you might have studied this in literature or history class. We have something called the Harlem Renaissance. So obviously it comes out of Harlem, out of New York, and it was a movement that really tried to portray themes of the working class as heroes against racism and other forms of social injustice. It was really brought on by the migration from the South to the North. So a lot of post-Civil War Blacks in the South were trying to find a better life, to get away from the discrimination of the South and move to the North. And so they were going to major cities, so things like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and so on. And so in the Harlem Renaissance, we had something that's called the New Negro movement, and that was championed by Alan Locke. And he would encourage artists to work in an African style. So just like Wifredo Lam, let's work in a style that recalls cultural heritage. And so this is something we saw not only in visual art, but we also saw it in music and literature. So this is actually painted in a library. Sorry, this is Aaron Douglas. I want to make sure I have his name. This is painted in a library, and a lot of these pieces were put in public locations, just like the paintings of Diego Rivera. And a lot of it too, you know, especially if it happened in the 1930s, were part of the New Deal and the WPA, where Roosevelt was trying to put in his administration, was trying to put Americans to work during the Great Depression. And so artists would be paid to paint murals in a lot of public spaces. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's not the 250, and we sadly have a lot to get through today. But when you look at this image, you really do understand, there's a lot of representation of Black history in the United States as well as in Africa. So if you look at the very top here, right, these are structures that are found in Africa that show like the greatness of African architecture. This looks like our mosque in Denji. So that mud, remember the mud mosque that we had in Denji in Mali, right? That is a structure very similar to that. Then this is another structure that is in, I think it's another mosque, but it's done in more of a kind of like a central plan mosque as well. But there's imagery of the Ku Klux Klan. There's imagery of slaves picking cotton. There's a central preacher. He's like an orator, right? Preaching freedom, right? And you can kind of see how the light kind of radiates out from him. We have soldiers, right? We have freed slaves. We have chains. So there's a lot of complex imagery here to kind of recall the story of Blacks in America. And so he does a lot of other images that are based on stories of Black history, identifying that Egyptians are Africans. And so like taking back, because of course in our history, we often think about Egyptian art as being Western art, right? It's the art before the Greeks. It was kind of pumped in with that, but it's art from Africa. Here we have a story of Noah's Ark, right? And so the artist that we have in the 250 is Jacob Lawrence, right? Jacob Lawrence. And the Whitney Museum in New York City has a great link that kind of talks about his upbringing and his art training. And so I'm not going to have us go to that today, but I just wanted to make sure that we kind of talk about it a little bit. So he immigrated from the South. So him and his family came from South Carolina as well as Virginia, and then they moved to the North. So they were part of that Great Migration. They first settled in New York and New Jersey, and then they eventually settled into Philadelphia. And most of his images, or a lot of his images, is based on this migration, right, from the South to the North, because they were looking for less explicit racism and then more, better paying jobs. So they were moving to the industrial North or the industrial Midwest, looking for factory jobs and so on. So his images tend to be based in themes. So he does a big series. He does like a series of pieces that are didactic. They tell stories. So sometimes they're based on important historical figures. He'll tell their story, sort of like the musical Hamilton, right? Tell the whole story of a one person. He does some images based on the slave trade, migration, and then pre-civil rights movement conditions. So talk about what the experience is of Blacks living in the South, but also he talks about the racism that he experienced in the North as well. So here are some of his images based on the slave trade, right? Here is about Harriet Tubman. And then this is number 141. This is panel 49 that we have in the 250. So you can see already that this migration of the Negro was a pretty big series. This is panel 49, right? So there's more, I think there's 60, if I remember right. Okay, let's look. You can write this, even though this is a different image, let's identify his style. How would you describe his style of painting? What are some words that you would use? If you were going to describe his work on a telephone to somebody who couldn't see it, what words would you use? Raphael, can you help me? You can take a second if you need it.
I would say like all the figures are very dark. It's not like very detailed, very simplistic.
So I'm going to use a fancy word for that. The figures are in silhouette. It's like a flat object, right, with detail. So it's almost like the sun is behind them and it wouldn't focus on them. And so there's no inner detail on the figure, right? There's no inner detail on the figure. Anything else that you would use to describe it? Anyone have anything else? There is detail here. Where do you place the color for the things that are non-black? Does anyone know what these people are doing in this image? This is also from the Migration of the Negro series. What are they carrying? Jeffrey, do you have any ideas what they're carrying?
Looks like their belongings.
Yep, they're basically, they got big giant bags and they're traveling right? They're traveling to the north or they're traveling to the train. They're on the road. So one of the reasons why he often did his figures in silhouette, right? Why did he lack detail? Is that this could be the story of a group of people. This could be a story about, you know, a large quantity of people. It's like a shared experience, right? So it's a shared experience rather than a story about one person. So there's not going to be a lot of identifiable detail to their face, so that you understand that this is not one person's experience. This is the experience of thousands. And then he gives you some different details, and he gives you some different colors that kind of, you know, tell the story. And it's done in a very abstract way, right? There's not a lot going on. So when I say that it's a stark composition, I kind of mean that it's very simplistic. It's got contrast between dark and light, and there's not a lot of visual information. It's abstracted. It's reduced to the basic elements. It's reduced to basic shapes, basic details, just like Cubism, and just like other styles that we talked about before that are abstract or stylized, right? It's flat, it's angular, we have those silhouetted figures, there's pattern. Almost feels collage-like. It almost feels like he's cutting apart and gluing it like flat pieces of paper. But this is all painted panels. So he's painting on wooden panels. So here's the train station. It's almost like everyone's going one direction, kind of going to the left. Kind of show that flight from the south, right? And then you can see here that in the migration of the Negro series, 49, right? This is 48 and this is 50. So you can see that they were meant to be seen together. I believe half of the collection is at the Whitney. I think half the collection is at the Philadelphia Museum. So it's actually split. So you can't actually see it the way that, you know, it was fully supposed to be seen. But Lord donated this to the museums in his own lifetime. He was very socially conscious, and he wanted as many people to see his work as possible, so he allowed it to be separated. Okay, so we're going to watch a video on this, and as we're watching the video, let's focus on what's happening, what's the content of the image, what do we see, and how does it reflect the time in which it was made. And then, of course, just a refresher on his style, right? Just a refresher on his style. There is a longer version of this video on Smart History. We're watching the short version. So they did a great job explaining all those differences in that visual imagery that we have. Oh, sorry, I had next slide. So keep in mind that we can see the faces of the white people on the left, right? I mean, they will mention the size of this guy's hands, but I'm drawn to his brow, right? He just looks really pissed off, doesn't he? His brow is arched down, his nose is scrunched up, you can't see my face in the discussion, but like, you can almost imagine he's like, I'm mad, right? How dare I have to sit by other people, right? And so he really does tell a story of the segregation that people felt in the North as well, right? This is not a depiction of the South. This is a depiction of the North. And African Americans were feeling, right? They were feeling separate in the North as well. Sometimes it was more explicit by this, right? There's more things that people said than a Black only drinking fountain, right? Sometimes there still was separate places for Blacks to eat versus the whites. So there was this stuff happening in the North too, and a lot of us, think about history, we tend to think it only happened in the South, right? So he's talking about that experience that he encountered too, right? This is his personal life as well as the life of people he knows. So here's another examples of that kind of geometric kind of quality. He chooses where he puts the color, right? He chooses where he puts the detail, right? Any questions on Jacob Lawrence? A lot of that was from the video, so I want to kind of move on, but does anyone else have any questions on him before we go on? So I'm going to zip through. I just want to show you some other examples. And so social realism was something that the WPA, this was a governmental group in the United States that was created during the Great Depression to give artists and other, we're talking about art, but just people in general, jobs. And so a lot of artists were able to create paintings. And so this is, once again, trying to move fast, and of course that makes me feel, this is Benton. Excuse me. So he made these these large murals, and here we have like factories, buildings. So he's talking about industrialization, and probably industrialization made for the war. So we see planes being built. We have images of like the Roaring 20s. This is actually kind of like in the ceiling. So a lot of these zigzags that you see here are parts of like the architecture of the room. More industrialization, like, you know, metal smithing or metalwork, probably a steel factory, workers in the fields, and then the rise of Nazism. So he was really depicting imagery for the people. And so these were typically in places that people could view them, right? So public spaces. Edward Hopper is a part of what we call the American scene. And so you've probably seen this one at the Art Institute Chicago. It's called the Nightbox. He was not necessarily working for the WPA, but he was a canvas painter. So he made canvas paintings. And he kind of talked about isolation a lot in his images. Living in a major city with all these people around, but you still often feel alone. So late night in a cafe, sitting in a laundromat waiting for your clothes to be dried, sitting in a restaurant eating food, being at a movie theater but not watching the movie. This is Edward Hopper. His artworks tend to have kind of a voyeuristic kind of feel to it. It's like you're looking at someone who you're probably not supposed to, right? Sometimes they actually do look like you're looking in a window. Grant Wood, another famous regionalist, American scene painter. And so he was from Iowa, and he depicted this kind of mocking interpretation of what most people think of as a father and daughter relationship, the stern father figure and this rebellious daughter. And of course, you guys look at her and go, well, she doesn't look rebellious to me, but she has this one curl, this one little hair that's coming out of her bun. And that's supposed to represent that she's rebellious. I mean, I'm sure she gets in a lot of trouble, right? So American Gothic is the architecture, right? That little white farmhouse has a Gothic window behind it. It's actually modeled after his sister and his dentist. So those are the two models for his pretty realistic depiction. This one is very different than the rest of his paintings. A lot of his other paintings depict kind of rural life in Iowa, have these rolling hills, very different than what it looks like here in Illinois where it's so flat. And then this is actually based on Paul Revere's Bride. But his style typically is actually pretty abstract, right? It's not realistic depiction of landscape. Here's Washington cutting the cherry tree. The depictions of American history, right? And then in photography, we have this heroic age of photography. And this is a photo by Dorothea Lange. She did actually work for the WPA. She was hired to go around and take pictures of hardship of the American worker. And so she would often go into the South. This is actually was done in California. There was this migrant mother. So she moved to pick food during harvest. So wherever things were ripe and ready to pick, she would take her family and go pick things. So she was supposed to be picking peas. So peas, but it had frozen and the crops were devastated. So she's trying to figure out how she's gonna feed her children. And when you look at the mother, you're like, wow, she's kind of older, right? Like you like guess her age. You might think she's like in her 40s because she's kind of got this wrinkled forehead. She's got crow's feet and whatnot. But I think she was either late 20s or early 30s. So the hardship of her life really did age her. And Dorothea Lange took a lot of photos before she made this famous one. And eventually it was on Life magazine. And it really did bring kind of recognition to the hardship of the migrants or the working poor in the United States. Okay. So we're going to move on to the art that happens after World War II. And so once again, we're going to kind of zip through a few examples of them, but I want to give you a little taste of why things start to happen. So we're going to look at the development of modern art focusing on abstract expressionism. And so in the early 1900s in Europe, obviously we had the devastation of World War I, World War II. We had Dadaism, we had, Cubism, we had surrealism, but there's other styles as well. And so one of them is called German Expressionism. And so they were often trying to talk about how they were disillusioned by the effects of World War I, and then of course the rise of Nazism with World War II. And so there's a lot of emphasis on emotional content. And so Max Ernst, this is called Fit to Serve. And so the skeleton who served in the army, that's okay, right? So this would be World War I-ish. But often talking about the horrors of the politics, right? The chaos that ensues, right? So there's some abstraction there. I didn't show you all of them. I deleted a couple of here as well. But this is Max Beckmann, and so he did a lot of diptychs and triptychs, and he did them in a very sort of religious style, kind of harking back to these great German painters like Grunewald as well. In sculpture, right? In sculpture, we have a very abstract style that's developing. Remember that this is really coming right after Rodin. Remember Rodin was like sort of realistic still. This is quite different than that. It was very much inspired by Cubism and by morphic forms from surrealism. And so this is Barbara Hepworth. She was married to Ben Nicholson, who was one of those sort of the Spiel Mondrian-like artists. And she would often make sculptures that were multiple. And so they were interacting in some sort of way. Sometimes they would have inner parts, so they have this sort of human-like quality. You can imagine if you would rub your hand across the metal, it would be like a heart, you would hear it, it would vibrate, kind of like the heartbeat inside a body. So she has a lot of these very simplistic, minimal sculptures in wood, in marble. This one is called Two Figures, and she compared it to our husband and mother, or husband and wife group that we have from Egypt. This is Henry Moore. He's a British artist. You probably have seen some of these. There's a lot of these refining figure images in, outside major museums around the world and the United States. He made them in wood, he made them in stone. So they look like reclining figures, either reclining nude, but also they have echoes of Mesoamerican art, like the Chamol figure. Remember that there was one of these at Temple Mayor in Mexico City. This one is wood. And then this is Alexander Calder. He started first doing these little wire sculptures based on the circus, and he's best known for his moguls, right? One of the things we notice about moguls, and if you've taken physics, I know at North anyway, they make moguls, is that the key with a mogul is that you should be balancing things that are unequal. You wouldn't want to put the same thing on both sides. So this is called lobster trap. So this black figure at the bottom, it rotates in space, and that's supposed to be reminiscent of the lobster in water, because this would move and glide just like it was in the waves of the water. And then of course this wire thing on the right side is the trap, right? So that's the lobster trap that the lobster would get caught into. And so if you go to the museum and see a Calder, I would suggest that you, from a distance, gently blow air, right, at post-COVID, of course, blow air at them and watch it rotate in space. It's always changing. He also made stabiles, so like floor pieces. So this is a small sculpture. And then he started making larger outdoor sculptures. This is a relatively small one called the Crab. And then more monumental is the one in Federal Plaza in Chicago, and this is called Flamingo. It's done in the Calder lens that he was kind of known for. Okay, so now let's move on to abstract expressionism. So abstract expressionism is a part of what we call modernism. Remember, we had this theme already, our isms, and we're focusing on the second part. Because of World War II, a lot of artists immigrated to the United States. And so we have art moving from Paris and New York becoming the dominant place for artists to be. And of course, the major style of the second half of the 20th century is abstract expressionism and pop art. So there's another thing for kind of these later pieces, and this is also something you'll see in contemporary, so our postmodernist art as well. And American, but not so beautiful. It's a react stands for reactionary, frenetic, chaotic, right? It's a revolution against representation, realism, and the past. The R is a revolution against representation. The E stands for environment. We have painting, sculptures being placed in specific locations. They are like environmental experiences. They're made for certain locations. The A stands for action, and this is really used for abstract expressionism. You can see the motions of the artist in the work. The C stands for conceptual. So just like Dada, it's about the idea rather than the making of the art. And then T stands for transitory. So transitory actually alludes to a lot of different things. It could be about the process of making art. It could be about that the artwork would change over time. So just like colors, you blow on it and it moves, it would not be seen at the same space or time. It looks different in time. Some works are site specific. And then also just kind of talking about the movement from Europe to the Americas. Okay, so it's right after World War II, right? We still have European painting, right? We still have European painting, and it's still happening in Europe. So this is sculpture too. So Alberto Giacometti was an Italian sculptor who did a lot of representations of what the war did to the human spirit. So we have these emaciated, stick-like figures who are really bound to the earth. Notice how their legs are super, super skinny, but their feet are thick and really stuck to the world, right? They're stuck to the earth. And so it kind of recalls maybe the char of the burning of the bodies, or the malnourishment of people who didn't have enough food, displacement of people from where they live. So he was probably the major European sculptor of the early 1900s. Or excuse me, the middle, I should say. Right? This is Francis Bacon. He was a British painter, and he would take a lot of famous artwork, so like a Raphael, right? And he would upgrade it. And so you can see that his work is very expressionistic. You know, we got this garish, monster-like creature from this dark panel painting, right? And then, of course, why does he put two big giant slabs of meat behind it, right? His works are very, very scary, probably depicting the horrors of war as well as the horrors of society, because he was homosexual, and of course, he probably, you know, didn't feel like he fit in, and it wasn't like, you know, really tolerated by society of the day. And then this is Gorky. Gorky is basically, Gorky is pretty much an example of kind of a merging of styles. So Gorky is basically kind of looking at a biomorphic painting by Moreau, so surrealism, kind of the style of Kandinsky. So remember the Blue Rider expressionism of Kandinsky, and it's kind of the blending. So at the bottom is Gorky. And so this idea of taking from surrealism, taking kind of this automatic sort of painting, incorporating the brush stroke, the expression of the artist, really lends itself to abstract expressionism. So even though we often think of it as an American movement, it is something that really developed in Europe, and the American artists really like went with and then became world famous from it. So abstract expressionism is really based out of New York City. Sometimes it's called the New York School instead of called abstract expressionism. It's a combination of expressionism and abstraction. So of course, expressionism is emotion, right? Abstraction is that distortion of reality, and it's rooted in surrealism, right? It's rooted in the idea that you just automatically paint. There's no real thought, or it looks at least like there's no thought to how it will make, right? It looks like it's just kind of thrown onto the canvas, right? They were opposed to the use of reason, a very surrealist or Dada kind of thought, right? They tried to make works that would be accessed or be able to be expressed through the collective unconscious. So a lot of these artists with psychologists who studied Jung, right? And Jung had a thought that we all at our core have common experiences and have a basic understanding of the world. And so there could be like a universal language we can all understand, right? And so artists tried to achieve this through things like improvisation, where they would drip or splash or fling paint on the canvas. There's a sense of spontaneity. There was a lack of unconscious control, or excuse me, a lack of conscious control, and that kind of trying to reach universal things. Now, the outcome of all of this is that we have these large, and when I say large, I mean large, wall-sized paintings that are really show the expression of feeling through bold application of paint and colors. So in the 50s, we have our action painting, right? Action painting. And so probably the best known artist of this is Jackson Pollock. He's not in the 250, so I'll try not to blow on him too much. But Jackson Pollock was known for these large paintings. He grew up in Montana, full of really large spaces. And he studied after Bentley, so the guy who did all those murals that we just saw, he studied under him, who also painted big. And he also studied Navajo sand painting. And it seems, Navajo sand painting seems very random, but it's not. Shamans have very methodical ways that they apply it. And so he took all this knowledge to develop this style that really looks like he is slattering nonsense on a canvas, right? We often call Jackson Pollock Jack the Dripper. Instead of Jack the Ripper, Jack the Dripper, right? And so what he would do is he would roll canvas out on the floor and he would take latex house paint. So this was not oil paint. This was not the paint that you get in an art store. This is the stuff you would paint the inside of your house with. Or it could even be exterior oil-based house paint. And he would take a brush in it, and sometimes he would dilute it down with turpentine or dilute it down with water. And he'd fling the paint on the canvas. And he would go slow to create little, create puddles. And he would flick the wrist to create really fast sprinkles of paint or long marks of paint across the canvas. And so when you look at a painting up close, it's layers and layers and layers of paint. Sometimes you're also able to see things like cigarette butts and banana peels because he was eating and smoking and drinking as he made these, right? So it's really a blend of expressionism and formalism, right? He's giving up his emotion as well as the act of painting. When he's making it, you can see his marks. You see the splattering, you see the gestures, you see all that. But it really is a lack of imagery, right? It's very formal. It's really about contrast and it's really about technique, right? We can't say, oh, it's a landscape, oh, it's a portrait. It's non-objective, right? So it really is about expression of his moment of work. His wife, Lee Krasner, did these large gestural pieces as well. This reminds me a little bit of Wifredo Lam in a way that we just saw with those vertical sort of elements. And so she would take broad brushstrokes and make these really large sweeping motions to her paintings. Right? And then the artwork that we have in the 250 is by Willem de Kooning. He was a Swiss immigrant to the United States. And so how does his work actually, let's look at this for a second. This is number 145. So if you guys want to get out your study guide for 145, right? Right? Let's look at how his work is abstract expressionist, right? So this work is all about the emotion of the artist, right? It's about the emotion of the artist. You see every single brush stroke, right? You see the physical movement of the artist, right? And so this includes this rapid application of paint. Now, one of the things that de Kooning did that was different than Pollock is he also would take things and scratch into the painting. So it almost like he would scrape away imagery and then he would apply more on top. So these paintings tend to be really thick, kind of like impasto in certain areas, and then other areas he scraped away color. So here you can see some of that. So here's that thick paint, and then here you can see how in some of these areas he scraped away the paint as well, like on the left. Right? So this is a little different, right? Now, I showed you Jackson Pollock, right? And I'll show you really fast another artist that did this kind of these large paintings. But there's a lot of Jackson Pollock imitators during this time. So there's going to be a lot of paintings in New York City as well as other major cities of the world that look just like Jackson Pollock, a bunch of drips on a canvas, right? And this work, even though it's abstract expressionism, is a little bit different. And I think that that's why they included the Kooning rather than Kahlo in the 250 because it's being a little different. How do you think it is, like, what's the biggest stark difference between this work and the one we just saw of Kahlo, right, with the drips? Sorry, I thought it was close. Eva, can you help me out here?
There's a figure in this one of a woman.
Right. So there's definitely a representational, or excuse me, a abstracted version of a woman here. And this is called Woman One. He did a series of these women issues, or women paintings, I should say. And so when we look at his work, they tend to be very abstract and angular. You can write this in your form section on your note takers. They tend to be kind of monster-like. They are very large, so these are still rather large canvases. Now, unlike a palette, these are not like wall-sized canvases. These are probably more like 6 feet tall, 5 feet tall. So for the people in the house, that painting's probably about that size. It might be a little small, but not much. Okay, so they're large. They all, a lot of them also sometimes, well, I should say all of them. Some of them also tend to have kind of like bleach blonde hair and like really bright lipstick or makeup. So notice the red lips and like the eyeliner around the eye. And they also tend to be very voluptuous. So they tend to be very large women with large breasts. And so there's a lot of thoughts about where his inspiration is. A lot of people look at some of these women paintings and equate them to like the Venus of Willendorf with this prehistoric notion of kind of like this fertile woman. However, de Kooning talked about how he was making works that were depicted based on art history and pinup culture, right? So in the 1950s, here's a Marilyn Monroe image, right? Norma Jean image. And he was often inspired by how women were depicted as art in history, right? And you can see how this is a deviation from Picasso's notion of these monstrous women, right? With probably that inclusion of that blonde hair and red lipstick from the pinup culture. This is a landscape that's at the Art Institute. We don't have a woman image, or at least the last time I looked, there's not a woman image by de Kooning at the Art Institute. This instead is a landscape. This is really typical of a lot of those abstract expressionist painters out of New York. I'm just going to finish up looking at a few more abstract expressionist painters, and then we'll start off on Monday looking at the transitional period between abstract expressionism and pop art, and then we'll finish pop art so that we're ready for our quiz on Wednesday. And we might get a little bit farther into it so that we have more time to study for the exam at the end, right? So from gestural abstraction, right? We have another abstract expressionist style, and this is called color field painting. This personally is my favorite version of the abstract expressionism, and it's based on Asian mysticism. It's based on poetic color to create mood, and often they're very meditative. So they are large, non-objective paintings. So once again, they don't necessarily have visual subject matter, and they typically have visual forms of color. And so Mark Rothko is a great example of this style. These are large monumental canvases that should be viewed kind of from a distance. So when you're standing in front of one of these canvases, you're probably like 4 to 6 feet away from it, and you kind of just stare at the painting. So this one is really dark, right? And if you look at it carefully, it's a dark kind of reddish violet color underneath. underneath. And then he uses thin oil paint to put that reddish color on top, then the bluish color, and then that beigeish color at the bottom. So you can see the undercolor popping through. And sometimes they're really dark and solemn, and sometimes they're really bright. And they're really supposed to be experienced in a kind of meditative way. So he studied Zen Buddhism and practiced Zen Buddhism, and it's reflected in his work. So just like this little boy used to stand in front of it and feel the color. So when you stand in front of one like this, something like this used to be at the Art Institute Chicago. It's almost like when you're standing in front of it, you feel like the sun is in your face, right? It's like this brightness to it. So they're kind of experiential pieces. Towards the end of his life, his work tended to get very dark. You can see how he paints. There's a whole series based on how artists were able to achieve what they did. There's a Kooning example too. You want to see how to paint like Kooning. Right? And some of his later pieces, this is actually in a chapel in Houston, and it's a series of glass paintings that are used for prayer and meditation. That must be the last one. Oh, yeah, because I skipped a few others. Okay, so we're going to end there today. And so we'll continue looking at pop art on Monday, and then we will have our quiz on Wednesday.